Hiddy die die die. Hiddy die die die. Hiddy die 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 die. Hiddy die die die. Hiddy die die die. Hiddy die 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 and die die. Hiddy die die die. Hiddy die die die. Hiddy die 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 yada die die. Hiddy die die die. Hiddy die die die. Hiddy die die yada die die. Everyone got that? Let's do that one more time. Hiddy die die die. Hiddy die die die. Hiddy die 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 die. Hiddy die die die. Hiddy die die die. Hiddy die 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 die. Bye bye. Hiddy die die die. Hiddy die die die. Hiddy die 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 die. Yada die die. Hiddy die die die. Itty die die die. Itty die 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 die. Yada die. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for joining. Great to see you all. Looking forward for any newcomers here. I see one newcomer. We're going to share on the malacha for the next 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for any tangents or ideas folks want to pursue. This is a heavy one. This is a heavy one. There's so many directions we could go with Koteiv. Koteiv. The 32nd malacha is Koteiv, writing. Writing. More specifically, according to the Talmudic rabbis, one that is engaged in a writing of two or more letters, not writing one letter, but two or more letters. In the construction of the Mishkan, writing, and specifically writing two letters or numbers, was used to match corresponding planks and boards with one another. Think of construction work. We might further say that one letter by itself is perhaps merely a squiggle, but two letters can form a word and have meaning. It is worth noting that Hebrew has no one-letter words. Isn't that interesting? Whereas English and other languages do have words that contain one letter, such as A or I. On a rabbinic level, even writing one letter is Koteiv, as opposed to a biblical level, that is. Writing with foods, such as ketchup or icing, would not be Koteiv, as long as one intends to eat that food on Shabbat itself. Okay, so let's think about language. Let's think about language. Language has always been complicated from the start. We learn in the Torah about the power of language. What's the first case? What's the first case in the Torah you would think of as being, yeah, good. The most obvious case here that has to do with language, the story of the Tower of Babel, Migdal Bavel. God seeks human unity, but also wants diversity. But diversity without collaboration and respect leads to moral chaos. On the other hand, unity without diversity leads to tyranny. Sometimes the tyranny of an individual tyrant, and sometimes the tyranny of the majority and the oppression of difference. In the story, this is symbolized through language. God wants us to work together, but also be different. The passage begins by informing us that all spoke only one language with few words. So in response to the oppressive unity of the people of Babel, God mixes up their language. Rashi understands this to be the origin of many different languages and spreads humanity across the globe. The Midrash asks the question, why did God destroy the society of Sodom, but only scattered the society building the Tower of Babel? Get it? Sodom destroyed, but Migdal Bavel, Tower of Babel, only scattered. The answer given is that the people involved with the Tower of Babel demonstrated that they love each other by speaking one language. So God didn't want to rid them of the world, entirely, and therefore only scattered them. But the people of Sodom hated each other, so God wanted to eliminate that from the world. Indeed, it stands to reason that understanding each other can lead to love, and failing to understand one another can lead to fear and hate. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs explains the challenge of how different languages block us from communicating with one another. We often miss the significance of this word, shema, to listen, because of what I call the fallacy of translatability. The assumption that one language is fully translatable into another. We hear a word translated from one language to another and assume that it has the same meaning in both. But often it does not. Languages are only partially translatable into one another. The key terms of one civilization are often not fully reproducible in another. The Greek word megalopsychosis, for example, Aristotle's great-souled man, who is great and knows who he is, carries himself with aristocratic pride, is untranslatable into a moral system like Judaism, in which humility is a virtue. The English word tact has no precise equivalent in Hebrew, and so on. And friends, this is one of the great conflicts around how much to incorporate English into Jewish prayer. Communal prayer, that is. The Reform movement, of course, has no problem. There's some tensions, but by and large, no one's going to push back to incorporate English prayer in Reform synagogues. Orthodoxy also has very little problem because it's taken for granted that it's going to be an all Hebrew service. The conservative movement has the most struggle with this in regards to when to incorporate English and when to stick to the Hebrew. Traditional conservative congregations, of course, will stick almost entirely to Hebrew, bracketing things like prayer for the government or prayer for Israel. But liberal conservative grapples the way Reform used to with how much English to pop into the service. And one of the challenges there is, geez, are we saying the same thing? Like these English words, do they in any way, this is only one of the many challenges, of course, are we actually saying the same thing? Because as Sachs talks about here, the fallacy of translatability, the fact that Shema, listen does not really get at what Shema is saying. Shema has a much deeper context that we could explore at another time. Famously and controversially, Rabbi Sachs also once taught in the course of history, God, quote unquote, in the course of history, God has spoken to mankind in many languages, through Judaism to Jews, Christianity to Christians, Islam to Muslims. It turns out he was later pressured to retract this statement on religious pluralism that may seem obvious to many of us. Nonetheless, he was pressured to retract that. This idea that God speaks different languages to different peoples. One of the most complex dimensions of language is an attempt to explain divinity or prove that there is a God. Okay, so now we're going to move into a section where we talk about proofs of God. Does God exist? Okay, there's three classical philosophical approaches to proving the existence of God. These are the three classical philosophical approaches to proving the existence of God. First, ontological arguments. That means a priori, abstract reasoning, suggesting the necessity of a perfect being, right? For the world to exist, there must have been a perfect being who put it into place. The cosmological arguments means there's a first mover, which is God. This is the question of, well, if the world, like something had to start everything, of course, you can ask the question then, well, then where did God start? And then you also can't really get anywhere. But even if you say Big Bang or whatever you say, whatever was the beginning of time, to say, well, where did that come from? Then thirdly is the teleological arguments, the idea that the order of the world and universe shows that there must be a purpose that was designated for life. There's a purpose to life. And if there's a purpose, who put this purpose in place? But today, rather than offering proof, many speak of beauty, like the beauty of the world, or of gratitude. They express their feeling that the world is just so beautiful and wonderful that they need an address for their gratitude. Others talk about how they've experienced miraculous divine help. A belief in God can also lead to optimism about the future and to a sense that life is sacred. But how is one to explain that in tangible terms? How can that be expressed in words? For some, the entire matter can't be discussed through a prism of objectivity, but rather only through the human realm of subjectivity. This is to say that the realm of consciousness is far deeper and further reaching than the realm of language and cognition. According to Rambam and his negative theology, we can't really say anything specific about God at all. Rather, we can only describe what God is not. God is not mortal and has no physical features. Maimonides states expressly that any description of God's physicality, such as God's taking the Israelites out of Egypt with a strong hand, is strictly metaphorical. While we can't find adequate language to prove the existence of God, perhaps more important than the question of whether we can believe in God is whether God can believe in us. More than focusing on any theological and philosophical concerns, we should be spiritually focused on the moral concern of how we are doing. In keeping with the need to move the question back to personal responsibility, the Kotzker Rebbe famously answered the question, where is God? With wherever we let God in. To the sages, more important than believing in God is loving God. This idea is expressly stated in the opening of the Shema prayer. We are commanded, v'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha. V'ahavta, right after the Shema, right? You are to love God. There is no corresponding biblical mitzvah to believe in God. There's no mitzvah that says that we must believe in God. Of course, the first of the 10 commandments it starts with Anochi, I am God. So it's sort of implicit in there, but it's not an explicit mitzvah. Love as an emotion and a deed can be more powerful than a faith statement or logical proof. What would it mean to say, I believe my child exists? Okay, great job. But to say I love my child is much more profound. It assumes some level of belief that they actually do exist. That's probably helpful. But the love moves to a different level. It moves us toward experience. It moves us from abstraction to experience. And religion ultimately is not about proofs, but about experience. Consider this poem from Leonard Cohen, the great Rabbi Leonard Cohen, titled Fun. It is so much fun to believe in God. You must try it sometime. Try it now and find out whether or not God wants you to believe in him. It's about trying. It's about experimenting. It's about experience. Perhaps all of the language trying to explain God is merely a crutch that we find ourselves using even as we ultimately need to get beyond that point. We can use the idea of a personal God, a relatable God, an anthropocentric vision, all expressed through human language, to realize that divinity is beyond it all. This concept is referred to in Kabbalah as Ein Sof, literally meaning there is no end. Our intellectual and spiritual lives cannot be reduced to purely physical terms. The physicalist, materialistic worldview that all reality is concrete has major flaws, and thus any secular logical attempts to prove or disprove God through language is flawed. While Nietzsche famously proclaimed that God is dead, he also wrote, I am afraid we are not rid of God because we still have faith in grammar. We still have faith in grammar. We are very wedded to language as a means to communicate, to learn, and to pray. By the way, just to state the obvious, although you never know what's obvious to who, when Nietzsche said God is dead, he wasn't saying, oh, in modernity, we now know there's no God, or the theological proofs of God are dead. What he meant, to my understanding, based on interpreters of Nietzsche I have read, is that the construction we had of divinity has expired. We have evolved to a different stage, and merely having a word called God represent something that is so far beyond comprehension. That concept has expired. I know a rabbi in Israel who says, why would you talk about God in America? It's going to alienate every Jew. The word is so meaningless and so futile, right? Use some of the Hebrew words to talk about divinity, which offer much more profundity. In fact, what's funny is I was eating dinner a few nights ago and my 6-year-old son came over and he says, Abba, what does God mean? And I said, and I wasn't sure what he was asking. I said, what do you think it means? He's like, no, what does the word mean? I just don't know what the word means. I said, I don't know what the word means either. I said, but it's what in Hebrew we sometimes call Hashem. He says, oh, Hashem is God? That's all he was asking. He just didn't know what the word meant. I thought he meant like, what is God? He just meant like, what is this word people are using called God? I never heard of that. Like, I know who Hashem is. He calls her feminine, by the way. He says Hashem that she talks to him, or she protects him. Language is about ways to share a common experience of living in the world, of articulating a shared reflection of reality as it has been presented to us. Edmund Husserl, a German philosopher and founder of phenomenology, in his 1931 book, Ideas, A General Introduction to Pure Phenomenology, argued that we must liberate ourselves from the captivity of the accepted world. We have come to see everything through an accepted filter of facts and truths and bracketed off most of reality and the depths of consciousness. But we can see more and experience more. Indeed, moving beyond convention and into the depths of subjective experience is the essence of spiritual seeking. We find ourselves so limited because we consider the options, those which have been presented to us. But at every moment, there are multiple ways of being, multiple ways of engaging, multiple ways of leading. I wonder if his picture makes his ideas more or less exciting. He looks really excited about the ideas he's teaching. But before we can go deeper and even beyond the depths, we need to find our inner calm and turn off the noise. We must be aware of our inner turmoil and discover strategies to keep inner peace within these tense moments. Before we can calm our interior experience of ourselves, we will first need to overcome fear. Fear, like anger, is one of the great barriers towards growth. What are the main steps to overcoming fear? Number one, name the resistance. Number two, surrender to that resistance. Number three, welcome. And number four, embrace or love. Okay, as fear emerges. We can reopen choice for ourselves and disempower our small inner voice of critic. We must stand tall and push out our inner saboteur. Each of us is capable of moving beyond language, conquering internal barriers and going deeper. So let's look to the east. Now we're going to pivot east. Buddhism is based on the Four Noble Truths: the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth of the end of suffering, and the truth of the path that frees one from suffering. Buddhism suggests that in order to end suffering, one must follow the Noble Eightfold Path. Now, Jainism. In Jainism, one of the most basic ideas is anek-antavada. Anek-antavada, the idea that different points of view perceive reality differently, and therefore there are no points of view that are fully true. Great emphasis is placed on equality of life, spiritual independence, nonviolence, and the fact that an individual's behavior has immediate consequences. In Jainism, self-control is crucial for one to understand the soul's true nature. Now, turning back to the West, let's consider Avicenna, one of the most influential philosophers of the Islamic Golden Age. Avicenna presented an idea called floating man, according to which he described the immateriality of the soul. He encouraged his students to imagine themselves suspended in the air. Think of this for a moment. Think of yourself suspended in the air. When one hangs in the air, one will experience an isolation from one's senses and not have sensory contact with one's own body. With the isolation from the senses, Avicenna argued that a person would still have consciousness. He believed that one couldn't logically prove a soul, but rather one needs to experiment to find it and experience it. Now, just a reminder, Avicenna is from the 10th century, 10th, early 11th century Common Era. And Rambam is reading Avicenna. He's very influenced by him. He calls him Ali ibn Sina. And when the Rambam read Avicenna, and he was deeply influenced by his ideas, as that's how he accessed, one of the ways he accessed Greek philosophy. Professor Daniel Matt, a noted contemporary scholar of Kabbalah, writes, the creative pool of nothingness is the pre-conscious, the kadmut hasechel, which precedes, surpasses, and inspires both language and thought. Okay, so this is just a reminder, this idea of ayin. Ayin means nothingness, and it's the pre-conscious state that that precedes language and thought. Of this, Dov Ber of Mezrich said, thought requires the pre-conscious, which rouses thought to think. The pre-conscious cannot be grasped. Thought is contained in letters, which are vessels, which the pre-conscious is beyond the letters, beyond the capacity of the vessels. This is the meaning of the verse found in Job. Wisdom emerges out of nothingness. Okay, so that's very interesting. That would be a fun verse to meditate on. That chokhmah, wisdom, chokhmah, comes out of ayin, out of nothingness. Which you would say, what is that nothingness? But here we see a definition of nothingness, which is the pre-conscious divine/human state that precedes or perhaps transcends or surpasses language and thought. It is what in transcendental meditation one would be seeking to tap into. One other way to understand this is through the idea that communication is about far more than just the words we speak. Albert Mehrabian, a contemporary psychologist and pioneer in the field of nonverbal communication, offered what has famously become known as the 7%, 38%, 55% rule, right? His research showed that only 7% of our feelings and attitudes are conveyed through our words. The tone of our voice constitutes 38% of the communication, while 55% is conveyed by body language. In fact, communication happens in subtle and meaningful ways beyond words. So too, the soul and human consciousness at large perceive far more than the limited messages that words can convey. Then we look at some stories in religious texts that appear fantastical, perhaps even absurd, and we wonder what they're doing there in the text. Rabbi Dr. Arthur Green writes, I know that religious language is not just a collection of stories, but an attempt to put into narrative form a truth so profound that it cannot be told except when dressed in the garb of narration. Of course, in Kabbalah, garb is very important. This idea that everything has clothes, it has an exteriority to it that does not, that hides the interiority. What holiday, friends, are we celebrating in 2 weeks? Or is it next week? I think it's 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks. What holiday are we celebrating? Purim.
Purim.
Yes, thank you. Purim is one of the most profound holidays. I mean, we make it for kids, and so it's about candy and hamantashen and costumes and lots of fun and games and screaming in the synagogue. And but actually, it's a very deep holiday. It's a very deep holiday, and there's so much to say about it. But this idea of starting to see the world as all truths as having clothes on them. All truths have clothes, and those clothes mask and cover up and hide in ways that are elucidating but also deceiving deeper truths that are present. And that is what Green is saying, following a long tradition, that all the narratives of the Torah have a much deeper essence to what is happening. Yes, we can read the Torah as human stories. This is about this person, and that is one level of the wisdom, right? Why did this person say that? Why did they do that? And what's that ultimately teach us about human psychology? But if you go deeper into the stories, we can see in the narrative that something else may be happening there for us. Rabbi Binyamin Lau, who's a noted contemporary Israeli thinker and activist, writes about the sages' engagement with language. Better in his eyes was a single measure of reflection on what is written and given than massive speculation above and beyond to the very limits of apprehension. Here's what he's talking about. One who sees Rabbi Yishmael in a dream should anticipate wisdom. It says in the Talmud, Rabbi Yishmael's teachings contain straightforward logic, and with it lucidity, simplicity of language, and an aversion to intellectual games. Attributions to him have no superfluity of language or florid expressions. He sought to strip scripture of anthropomorphisms and to excise unnecessary metaphor and imagery. But Rabbi Akiva's teachings sought to penetrate to inner depths with profundity and potency of language. He did not shrink from anthropomorphism, but rather he preserved the concrete in scripture, cherished imaginative meanings, added metaphorical embellishments, and created images of the supernal world. This is really a gift what Rabbi Lau gave us here, because he really offered a whole philosophy of language based on the Rabbi Yishmael's approach in the Talmud versus Rabbi Akiva's. Rabbi Yishmael wanting to move away from metaphor and superfluous ideas and more poetic expressions and move towards concrete literal language, and Rabbi Akiva's understanding of this profundity of language in a different sense. And it's worth thinking for ourselves, which one are we? Do we like really clear explicit language, or do we like mysterious language? This also has to do with the type of Torah we like to learn. Do we like to read stories from Chumash? Do we like to read abstract Kabbalah? Do we like Jewish law or Jewish ethics? Right, the type of language that resonates for us, and its clarity, its concreteness, and the like. Okay, on Shabbat we are encouraged to use verbal language, conversations, reading, praying, learning, but we are invited to consider a new relationship to writing. Through the process of writing, we create a lasting form of communication. Written language is positively transformative, but can also be deeply hurtful and damaging to others. This is all the more true in our age of interconnectedness, where on social media and beyond, words are not only saved and stored, but can go viral. May we always choose our words so carefully, understanding that they can never adequately describe the full truth, but also nonetheless how much they can affect others. In doing so, we'll learn not only to be more cautious with our words, but also how to listen and how to read more carefully. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "A riot is the language of the unheard." You've heard him say that before? A riot is the language of the unheard. When we don't listen to others who need to be heard, moral complaints will grow. In learning to listen to the language that comes from our depths, we can learn to listen to others. Doing so is not only spiritually rewarding, but also morally necessary. There's a Hasidic Shavort, a teaching that one of the Shivim Panim LaTorah, the 70 faces of the Torah, is not Panim Mamash, is not actual face or expression, but rather, ready friends, one of the 70 faces revealed at Sinai, which we read last week in Parshat Yitro, is Shtika, silence. One of the 70 faces of Revelation is silence. It's worth thinking about what it means to be in a covenantal, revelatory, moral relationship through silence. How is it possible not to be heard? How is it healthy not to be understood through the human channel of language? With all of that said, I think that communication by silence is mainly for God, and I think we should exercise silence as resistance with great caution, since silence has the potential to be politically has since silence has the potential to be political and politically dangerous. While committing while committing to Shmirat HaLashon, the ethics of speech, I think speaking out in resistance, even too much and even with imperfection, is more in line in many ways with Jewish values than waiting for perfect speech to bubble forth all the time in the privilege of our silence. There is, of course, a time for silence, but each of us must learn the art of emerging and retreating. The avoda, the spiritual growth curriculum is different for each of us here. Okay, to conclude, the malacha of Koteiv then reminds us to be mindful of not only our oral speech, but also our written word. Reflecting on writing on Shabbat allows us to take a step back and contemplate the writing we have engaged in during the past week, and will again do so in the coming week. Koteiv is the reminder we all need to choose carefully when to be silent and when and how to speak up. Okay, friends, that was a long one, but somehow we got through it in 25 minutes. So let's open the floor for thoughts and questions folks have on this material or anything related or unrelated.
I have a question about preconscious. I don't think I really understand it. Is it like what happened before the world was created?
Oh,
In the
great.
Tohu Vavohu, or?
Okay, great. So normally in the Freudian sense, we talk about the unconscious, the subconscious, and the conscious. The conscious, that of which we can hold because we're so aware of it. The subconscious, that which is like the iceberg just below the surface of the water. It's there, it's so connected to the conscious, and it's connected to the unconscious, and yet it is not totally graspable. It's like we're aware of it but can't fully articulating. And then, which we're very aware of, is the unconscious, the part of that is informing our mind and informing our being, but which we're kind of unaware of. I mean, that one we use so loosely in English language, that she unconsciously did X, Y, or Z. It's like unthinkingly, unknowingly, we all engage in unconscious acts. Now, the preconscious is fascinating. The preconscious is really dealing, as you're pointing to there, Lauren, with the primordial sense, this primordial state. What we would talk about this in the human being, the preconscious state would be that of what we would typically call the womb. The womb. Now, I don't know in any sense when memory, like when memory might begin within the womb, which is to say that unconscious memory. I don't mean conscious memory. Obviously, nobody has a conscious memory of the womb, right? But at what stage in the womb might there be unconscious memory, which is to say some awareness, and yet it's pre-conscious because it's before life. It's before life. It is before any consciousness at all exists. On the divine realm, we're dealing here strictly with the primordial state. That and you're right. This is very complicated because what would it mean for divinity to be pre-conscious? And one way we might articulate that is that to be conscious of the self, there needs to be the other. You can't know the self until there is the other. This is one of the ideas of why Chava is needed in addition to Adam, right? This one first human being, let's bracket the whole gender components of this, but the one first being created in the world needs a partner because there's no awareness of self without awareness of other. And if there's no awareness of self, then there's no responsibility. There is no self-identity, and there is nothing of any meaning. There's just an immersion, as like an infant has, even younger than an infant, a newborn has within themselves, an unawareness of a self. And so too God, in a primordial state, before there is the other, there's only God, is, you might suggest, is in a pre-conscious state, because there is yet a birth of an other. And once the other is born, that of humanity, there is now a consciousness of divinity that emerges in relationship to another. Now, that is all just kind of an abstract idea, which may resonate or may feel totally absurd. But yes, this idea of the pre-conscious as the primordial. But let me say one last thing, and it's more of a question than an answer, which is where the future and the past intersect. And where the future and the past intersect is in the Ein Sof, in the eternal, where time falls away. Time falls away. And what it means for time to fall away is that when we engage in spiritual acts that connect to the Ein Sof, we are tapping into the pre-conscious. We are transcending consciousness. We are transcending subconscious and non-conscious, which means it's there, but I'm not holding it, into the pre-conscious, into the primordial space of ultimate otherness. It's what Levinas will call the ethics of alterity. We truly transcend the self-consciousness into a deeper space. I hope that made any sense.
Can I just say one thing about the idea of consciousness in a newborn or in a prior to birth? Yeah. One amazing, I heard some lectures, I can't remember the name of the neonatologist who works with, or perinatologist works with babies, in the womb and post, talking about in the third trimester of pregnancy, the tremendous, developmental growth of the brain, and that the exposures in that time really organize the brain, and they organize the baby's brain in a direction of either trust or fear. And that it's so important that the whole idea of like the Mozart effect, or all of the things that people do, like babies born out of trauma and tumult, or babies born out into families with harmony, that there is actually an effect on brain development in terms of the organization of the neurons, because there's so many more neurons than the baby can use, and they're very disorganized, and they need to be arranged and organized. And that's the work of the third trimester of development in the baby. So that's just an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. It's very interesting and very helpful. And we know so much more than we ever used to know about the in utero impact upon fetuses. And one of the ways that I see this often is in guiding families, supporting families who are looking to adopt, and trying to understand the long-term impacts of pregnant mothers who were using substances, and understanding the long-term impact of that. It's interesting. We used to think that development was so much later. 20 years ago, there was this book you may recall called The Scientist in the Crib, where people used to think of the first 2 years of life as being like, okay, there's some very basic developmental things that are happening, but the really big things happen later. And then it talked about the scientist in the crib that showed how all these areas of development that we think emerge later are really in very significant ways are dependent upon those first 2 years of life and what's happening there. And then if you go even earlier to in utero, and you start to see also that deep impact of the pre-conscious realm, if you will. So thank you, Nona, for that very helpful idea.
So I would enter into here. I wanted to bring in the idea of the soul as consciousness. You know, we talk about the soul as if it's a thing that we have or we don't, and it comes in and it leaves us. But if we think of it in terms of consciousness, divine consciousness, that with that first breath, or that we don't know at what point the soul or that consciousness does enter it, and this is what all this modern scientific inquiry is about. It's an interesting way to look at it, and that awareness is a consciousness, and that perhaps when we talk about God, that is our evolved consciousness of being aware of being part of this field of being that we can't really totally understand, but that is alive and it is real. And that with that last breath, it goes back to where? What? Yeah. The right. Consciousness?
Right. Yeah.
Bring that idea into it.
That feels to me, Andrea, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that feels to me like, it feels to me like one of the top 3 most transformative ideas that religion offers to the world, and spirituality offers to the world. This awareness that the soul is consciousness, accessed through neshima, through the neshama, right? That the breath is the entryway into the soul, and realizing that that's ultimately a place we can tap into, a place where we can reside, is not only comforting, but challenging. It's not only comforting and challenging, it moves us from the theological proofs of God to the experiential realm of deeper being. And so I thank you for that. And I raised the question without having any answers of what does it look like or feel like to access consciousness, not through body, but consciousness through soul, right? Which is to say, not consciousness, I'm aware of what my body is feeling, not consciousness, I'm aware of what my brain is thinking, right? But a much deeper soul consciousness. And that's why we talk about Shabbat having the neshama yetera, this extra soul on Shabbat, where by pulling back, we actually pull into a new space where we can see much deeper. Now, I just want to say something about what Eileen wrote on the side there. Thank you, Andre, for that. That the Torah is dressed. It's funny, you know, you often feel like you're getting dissed in shul if they give you Galila, right? Because you get called up to the Torah, you get an aliyah, you're like, wow, this is great. I get called to the Torah, I make a bracha in front of the whole congregation, beautiful. And then you get Hagba. Oh, okay, Hagba, they must think I'm physically strong. I can lift up the Torah. This is a big deal. You get Galila, it's like, wah, wah. It's like you want to open the ark. You know, it's like it's like a fake honor. It's like, okay, fine, I'll open the ark. It's nice. I get to get called to the front. You know, but it's, you know, it's like, oh, Galila, I'm going to like wrap the band. What do you call the band you wrap around the Torah? I'm going to dress the Torah. But actually, yeah, the girdle. Yeah. And so, thank you. And so, is girdle an English word or is that a Yiddish word? It's an English word? English word. Okay. So I wonder, what do we call it in, what do we call it in Jewish? Girdle. It's the, okay, I don't know. There's got to be a word for it. Or girdle. Is it girdle? Is girdle an English word or is that a?
Girdle is like a belt.
Girdle's an English word? That's a Yiddish word. Gardel.
It's Yiddish. It's Yiddish.
It's Yiddish. Okay, like a Hasidic man. I don't know if Hasidic women do it also, but a Hasidic man wears a gardel, and the idea is that they want to separate the lower half of their body from the upper half. The upper half is sophisticated, the lower half is unsophisticated. They want to create that divide there. It has to do with the sphirot. In any case, Galila in the Hasidic thought is very deep. You're going to wrap the Torah. You're going to dress the Torah. It's not only a great honor, but it's like it is helping to realize the layers of depth and what you're able to access through that dressing of the Torah. So yeah, Lean, thanks for that reminder.
Galila actually is, so I finally got to go to an egalitarian congregation, and the gal asked me what I wanted, and I said, I really want Galila. I've always wanted Galila. Because I don't know, to me, maybe it's like a girl thing when you dress your doll, sorry for being sexist, but there was just something so sweet and nice about dressing the Sefer Torah. And then when you get to put like the crowns on top, it's lovely.
Yes.
So for me, it'd be my favorite aliyah to get.
Totally. Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. And it's also interesting because, Lauren, building off this idea, it's very profound to dress a child or dress a grandchild, or the truth is to dress a parent. If you've ever been a caregiver for a parent, to dress a parent, it's very profound to dress another person or dress a partner who's coming out of surgery or whatever the case is. This idea of dressing someone, such a deep care. What does it mean to take care of the Torah, right? To take care of the Torah, to bring not just a sense that the Torah is kind of pushing on us, but rather we are caregivers for the Torah. We're taking care of wisdom. We're taking care of transformative ideas. We're taking care of Jewish history, right? We are clothing it. We are wrapping it, right? When you view your relationship to Judaism as a caregiver, we normally think of it as I'm an educator of a Torah to my child, or I am a guardian of the tradition, or I'm a stakeholder, or I'm a student. But what does it mean to be a caretaker of our tradition, right? To carefully clothe the Torah, to guard it, to protect it like a child. I mean, it's a fascinating relationship. Imagine if you were preparing for Pesach Seder and you didn't think of it as fun or interesting. I mean, those are fine words, fine ideas, but you thought of it as how am I going to be a caregiver to the Pesach experience, right? That is now in my care to kind of pass forward. So it's interesting that idea. And one of the ideas I love, which I would love to see revived even more, is at traditional weddings. I don't know how this might work for women, but for men traditionally, a man will wear a kittel at the chuppah. I don't know if women are wearing kittels or not. I doubt it because they're wearing a beautiful wedding dress. I don't think they want a kittel, a white robe over their wedding dress. But a man who wears a kittel, the idea there is that sometimes they walk up and, oh, actually, is Eric still on here? Eric is on here. I had the great privilege of doing Eric's wedding. Eric, what was it, 10 months ago? Was it 10 months ago was your wedding? A year ago?
No, it's coming up T-minus February. It was February 16th, so we're getting very close.
Oh my goodness, it was right before COVID. It was my last wedding before COVID. And
oh
Eric,
my gosh, 51 weeks ago.
Eric, sorry to bring your, do you mind if we bring your personal journey into this for a moment?
Yes, that is quite all right.
Okay, so Eric, I remind me if you wore a kittel or not.
I don't.
Oh, you didn't. Okay, so we had talked about it. I remember us
did.
talking about it, and so I pictured you in the kittel, whether you did it or not. And so the idea of a parents wrapping their son in the kittel at the chuppah is an idea of you're now handing over your child to their spouse. You are no longer the primary caregiver of your child. Their partner is going to be the primary caregiver for each other, and this is the last time you're going to dress them. Here's an egalitarian way we can do that. That you wrap them together in a tallis. This is normally a Sephardic way, but at the chuppah, if parents, any living parents, any invited parents were together to wrap if it was a same-sex marriage, the chatan and the chatan, or the or the kala and the kala, or if it was a chatan and kala, wrap the couple together in the talis, in the talit, as a sign of, this is the last time I'm taking care of you, of dressing you, right? I'm going to have a different relationship to you in other ways, but now you're going to dress each other. You're going to dress each other.
We were so excited at the time that we that was the plan to have the kiddo, but if you remember, we were just in the zone that we just missed that part. So
one of the beautiful things about Eric's wedding is that Eric's wife Maria is it Filipino American?
Yeah, Filipino American.
Filipino American. And so we did this Filipino custom of, what was the wrapping ceremony called?
There's a Philippine custom where it was like their own version of a kiddo, and it was this exact item was done at her aunt and uncle's wedding and her grandmother's wedding. So this is oh
yes.
So it had the family history of doing that. So
it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing that to bring in an intercultural experience into a Jewish wedding, where Judaism has so many rituals at the chuppah, but to bring in another cultural expression into that moment can be really powerful. Anyways, let's pause here. Let's hear from someone else.
So there's one more very profound instance of dressing. I don't know anybody else here is on the Heber Kadisha, but when you dress the Met for the final time to put that garment on, and particularly when you cover the face, it's just, it's very, it's the final dressing. So it's also very profound.
Oh yeah, Andrea, thank you for that. If any of you have ever done Heber Kadisha, you know how profound this is. Remind me if I shared, I know we're in session 32 together, so it's hard to remember what I said in session 4, but did I tell you about Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi's experience with this? So he wrote the last book that was written about him during his life was someone in Boulder, Colorado. And she dealt with how he was preparing for death. And one of the things he did to prepare for death, and this is going to sound way out there, friends, is he had them do a mock Hever Kadisha for him. He pretended he was dead and got undressed, and went into a mikvah and had them wash his body, so that he could experience in some way, almost going back to the pre-conscious, experience in some way what that would look like. It was going to be the exact people washing him that he had designated to wash him after he died, right? It's really, I mean, for some that might sound incredibly weird and creepy. For others of you that might sound like really deep and powerful. And both of those are great. And so, but I found it just really fascinating of this idea of like trying to experience those moments in post-consciousness. We talked about pre-consciousness and post-consciousness, if you will. Nonetheless, well, actually going back to the soul, we say that the soul is still with the body until burial. That is why the body is to be watched, right? The shomer is with the body until burial. And that's also why Jewishly we try to have burial as quickly as possible, right? In the Hasidic world, in the ultra-Orthodox world, it's like within a day, right? They don't care about people flying in. The aunt wants to fly in, the cousin wants to fly in, they don't care. In the more liberal world, we wait for relatives to try to get to town. It might take 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. But in the ultra-Orthodox world, it's like same day or like next morning at latest. They want to do that burial. Don't care who's gonna make it into town. In any case, the soul is still with the body, is still present in this world until the burial happens. And so Zalman was saying, I'm going to be there in my deeper sense at my washing of my body. And yet I want to be there in an embodied soulful way during that state as well. So you're right. Thank you for that, Andrea, because when it comes to dressing with Purim and the masks, and it comes to dressing the Galila of the Torah, then we have the Hever Kadisha, the dressing of the body after it has been washed in preparation for burial.
I just read an interesting study in which scientists are now saying that when you die, you know you've died because your brain is still working for like 20 seconds, which is really fascinating.
Okay, so there's a couple complicated terms there, and because there's something high at stake here, Eileen, I do want to explore that. So in the ultra-Orthodox world, there's a critique of organ donation after death, and there's many critiques from that world, but one of them is a misdiagnosis of death. And what you'll see in the American news every year is, oh, someone came back from brain death. And the neurosurgeons and neurologists over and over say, you never come back from brain death. The only thing that could have happened is a misdiagnosis of brain death. If the brain is dead, it is dead. You can't return from that. And so the terms that I think are important here is death and brain consciousness, which is to say, if there's still brain consciousness, then from a brainstem perspective, it wouldn't be called death yet. It would be cessation of heartbeat. It might be that the person's life is irrecoverable. But if there is brain consciousness, let me look at animals for a second. I've argued for post-stunning in kashrut, post-stunning of the animal. That is to say, because of the Nazis, the kosher establishments are not willing to stun the animal before the shechita, before the slaughter of the animal. Because the Nazis said the Jews have to stun the animal. The Nazis said, Jews, the way you kill animals is not humane. Like, is that sick and ridiculous or what? The way you kill animals is not humane. And so you must stun the animal before. And the Jews resisted. They said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do it. You know nothing about what's humane, literally nothing. And so they resisted that. And because of that, no one is going to go back on what those Jews resisted and allow stunning of an animal before slaughter. However, I've written an article in the Huffington Post maybe 6 years ago, and around that we should stun an animal after shechita, after the knife has sliced the esophagus and the trachea. There is still pain for 30 to 90 seconds roughly, and if we stun the animal, we knock them unconscious, that would remove that last 30 to 90 seconds of suffering of the animal. In Australia, they're doing that. The kosher industry in Australia is doing that. And that's an interesting case where we look at this idea of an animal that halachically, according to Jewish tradition, is dead. It is now dead. And yet it's kind of a fake death in that there's still brain activity that's going on there. Okay, someone else, please. I know we only have 5 minutes left.
I had just a couple things
Great.
I just took a couple notes on what you said. One, in the beginning, I mean, I'm fascinated by language of all kinds. And you mentioned that in Hebrew, there's no one letter word in Hebrew.
Yeah.
What about the? And we used it later on. I mean, you said v'ohavta, for example, I mean, which is something that starts with the word and. But the is and, even though it doesn't stand alone.
Exactly. That's the key point, Cheryl. That's the key point. Is that the key point is that what is it called? Is it called a prefix? What do you call vav? Is that called a prefix in grammar?
Not really.
Yes.
In English, it's called a conjunction because it means and. It's a connector. It's a connector.
It's taught as a prefix.
A prefix. Okay. Yeah. So you're right. So yeah, Cheryl, it's a fascinating point, and that would be the challenge to the idea of a one-letter word. And yet, I think you're right, because it doesn't stand alone. I think that's the answer. Yeah.
Okay. And then the other thing that you mentioned about ayin meaning nothingness.
Yeah.
So there's a Hebrew letter that's ayin, which when my youngest daughter was in Solomon Schechter, her Israeli Hebrew teacher taught that ayin really does have a sound, and she tried to articulate. I mean, we still talk about it, she's almost 40 years old, and we still talk about that, Geweret Weissman said ayin, it has some sort of a sound. So I don't know. I mean, when I see it, I don't, it's a silent letter. That was just one thing. I was wondering if that's where the name of the letter came from also, or which came first.
Yeah, that's fascinating. To we talked last week about, because it was Parshat Yitro, about the Aleph of Anochi, right? Of the idea that the Aleph was the only thing revealed at Sinai, and the silence that emerges from that. And the ayin is another fascinating case of how the ayin functions differently from the aleph. And I have no idea to the second part of your question in terms of the historical emergence of that. But the idea that ayin is nothingness, this is not only the basis of existentialism of the 20th century and 19th century, but the basis in Kabbalah, as we talked about earlier with the Ein Sof, this idea of that nothingness for the rationalist, like in a Maimonidean sense, means that divinity is no thing. Divinity is no thing, and so it is nothing. It is nothing. That ultimately the Olam Emet, the world of truth, as opposed to Olam Sheker, this world, that goes back to Garbs also. In Kabbalah, this whole world is Olam Sheker. Everything in this world is a lie. Everything, which is to say, it is a lavush. It's a garment covering up a deeper truth. It is a klipa. It is a shell that needs to be liberated. That we need to liberate the essence. And so too, so the nothingness, the ayin of this world is on the one hand to say divinity is no thing for the rationalist, but then in the Kabbalistic, in the mystical sense, this idea of the nothingness being this pre-conscious or post-conscious state. And so I love what you brought up there, Cheryl, in regards to, in terms of.
And just one more statement, and that is, it came as no surprise to me that there is no Hebrew word for tact.
Oh, yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. That's very funny. That's very funny. Yes, that there's no, yeah. Jonathan Sacks was not known to be a humorous person. I mean, he told jokes, but that wasn't, there's a lot of great traits for him, but I think he was making a joke there. I think you're right that there's no Hebrew word for tact. If you've lived there, you know what I mean. Let me say one last thing before we conclude. This is Malacha 32, which means we only have, 6 left, and 6 left to go, and then we're going to move into a 40-part series of the 40 greatest debates in Jewish history. But if there was another series we were to start, it would be to look at the Aleph Bet and the meaning behind the letters of the Aleph Bet, because each letter is so deep. Just like we're tapping into the ayin here in the Aleph. The shin. The samech, for example, my ring, the idea behind a ring at a wedding is that it's a samech. It's a circle, like a samech. And the samech comes from somech noflim, like we say in Ashrei, that you lift up the downtrodden. You give a ring to someone to say, I will lift you up when you are down, right? And so each letter has hidden meanings in them around moral and spiritual teachings. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Can't wait to see you soon.